Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I'm here to do week 51 of my 2019 reads. This week I finished a couple of new things, and I also wrapped up some older things that I was doing for the Indigathon. So first, let me talk about the readings that I finished for the Indigathon. The first one that I want to talk about is something where I didn't quite finish all of it, but I did finish part of it. The Way of Thorn and Thunder by Daniel Heath Justice is a bind-up of a trilogy, an epic fantasy trilogy. This is something that I was reading for the Indigathon, and also that Ashley from Don't Have a Degree in Readings, Too Old for This Shit Book Club, was reading as the book club choice for November. I'll link information about the Indigathon and Too Old for This Shit Book Club below. This trilogy in the bind-up of The Way of Thorn and Thunder is something that I meant to read the whole thing of, but I decided to stop partway through. So what I actually read was the first 4 cycles out of 7 in that bind-up, which corresponds to the first 2 books in the series. The first book is Kynship, and the second book is Wyrwood. So I finished those, and I'm going to count them because I do want to talk about them. So these books take place in a world that is very Indigenous focused. So it's sort of a fantasy, epic fantasy world that is very similar to what was going on in the United States in the maybe late 17, early 1800s for, especially I think the author is of Cherokee descent, so I think it represents a lot of what was going on for the Cherokee people. There's things in here that I think probably are very similar to stuff like The Trail of Tears. So in this fantasy world, there are a people called kin, and they're not human. They're very different. They have like green or blue skin, and 3 fingers instead of 5, all these sorts of things. And they also can do things like wield magic, which is drawn from the earth source. They have a strong connection with the earth. At the same time, their world has come into contact with almost like a separate universe, it feels like, in that there is a rift in kind of space and that allows them to connect. And that world is the world of men. And men are very greedy, and they are trying to take the Wyrwood, take the place, take the homeland of the kin. And so that's what a lot of this story is about. And it's very interesting because it is told from an Indigenous perspective, and it has so much in there that really represents the values and kind of the ceremonies and interesting aspects of that perspective. So there's a lot in this that is really, really fascinating. However, overall, this series is very, very slow, painfully slow at times. I think that the pacing was very off, and it meant that it was really, really hard even to get through the first 2 books, much less the 3rd book, which was basically double the length of the first 2. So I ended up stopping at that point without finishing the story. I also had a couple of issues with things like the characters felt very one-dimensional to me. It felt like they were caricatures. So there was the fighter, and there was the, old wise woman, and there was the kind of plucky side character, and there was the innocent, and there was the bad guy, and it just felt a little flat to me, rather than complex and nuanced. However, I will say that there was some nuance in the plot and in how things were handled, in that, for example, within the kin, there were both good and bad kin. Some people who were trying to protect to fight their homeland, fight for their homeland, and some people who were selfish or who believed in other values and didn't want to protect the homeland. So there was some nuance there, but overall I felt like it was a little bit too slow, and it was a little bit too one-dimensional, too simplistic almost. It felt kind of raw as far as the material goes, and it could have used some refining. So overall, I gave both of these books 3 out of 5 stars. The other Indigenous read that I finished this week was Surviving the City by Tasha, Spillett, and Natasha, Donovan. This is another thing that I heard about from Ashley at Don't Have a Degree in Reading. It's a very short little graphic novel, which was very much what I was in the mood for this week. And it actually is rather heavy because it's a modern, like contemporary sort of teenager story about a pair of girls who are very close friends at their school, and they're going through a lot of issues. They live in Canada, and one of them is facing kind of like child services, who wants to take her away from her grandmother because her grandmother is sick, very sick with diabetes. And the other one is struggling because her mother was killed a year or two prior, and a lot of the story is really revolving around the difficulties that they face and how they're getting through it, especially with the help of their community and their traditions. So that was really, really beautiful. I really liked that aspect, even though the content was quite heavy. I felt like at times things were maybe paced a little weird, and at times the art style was slightly simplistic, but I really felt that this was a very good piece, a very good conversation about what's going on for these teenage girls, and I quite enjoyed it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now moving on to the non-Indigenous reads that I did this week. First is another graphic novel, Sleepless Volume 2 by Sarah Vaugh, Leila Duca et al. And this is the second volume, and basically what's it like, a duology, set in a sort of Renaissance style world with some interesting magic relating to manipulating time. One of the main characters is a knight who has a vow of sleeplessness, so he gives up his sleep in order to stay awake and constantly protect a princess. The first volume I read last week or the week before, and this concludes the story. The story, I think, is very, very much centered around political intrigue, and that gets very heavy in this second volume, where most of it is again about assassinations and about kind of political favor and the power of the king and a lot of these things. Again, political intrigue isn't as much my thing, so that didn't work so well for me. The art style was still very gorgeous, although I noticed that it didn't seem quite as refined as in the first volume to me for some reason. Like, I just noticed a couple of panels where things were not as well done. Also, the plot was kind of hectic. I preferred a little bit of a slower start. So I thought that this did a good job of concluding the storyline. I did really like the romance between the main characters. I liked also that it changed kind of the power dynamic as we went through, so that was interesting. But it didn't quite work as well for me in the second volume as it did in the first volume, so overall I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And lastly, I finished Monteverde by Lola Robles, translated by Lawrence Schimmel. This is a slim little novella, or novelette even, that I heard about from Rachel at Kalanadi, who I will link below. She did a video talking about science fiction books that centered around linguistics, and I love linguistics, so this was something that I just felt in the mood for and picked up, and it was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed it. It's basically a combination of an interview and old field notes by an interstellar linguist who went to a world and learned the language as well as about the culture of the people on that world. And it's really, really fascinating. Not only did I just really enjoy the writing style and the kind of contemplative, reflective, slow pace of the book, but I really loved all the linguistics. I loved also the focus on trying to understand the way in which the language is used to reflect the culture. In this, I think it's very interesting because there's actually 2 different languages or 3 different languages on this world, and as the linguist goes and learns about these different languages, understands the cultures, understands the differences between the people and the way that they communicate. It's very interesting, her journey in understanding. So I thought that was really, really enjoyable. I just had a great time with it. I do think that it has maybe a little bit of a colonial perspective because, you know, the linguist is going to this small unknown world. But I didn't feel like it was disrespectful of this, I mean, made up interstellar world. I didn't feel like it was disrespectful of that, just more it was an outsider perspective. In any case, I really enjoyed reading this. It kind of worked very well for me. If you're somebody who likes these more kind of reflective, slow, looking at culture type of books, I would recommend you pick this up. And I'm kind of interested in picking up other books in this series. This is part of the Conversation Pieces series, which seems to have a very feminist bent. And I've heard Rachel talk about this series before, so I'm kind of interested in picking up more by them. So that wraps up week 51 for me. If you've read any of these books or have any thoughts or comments, please leave them down below. I'd love to hear from you. Also, next week will be week 52, the last reading week of 2019. I will be posting my wrap up for that just a couple days late because I'll be out of town briefly, but once I get back I will record that and put it up. I wish everybody so much luck in finishing whatever you want to get read in the next week for the end of the year, and I'm excited about 2020.